Hello everyone, welcome back. So in this part, we're going to go ahead and save our variables into our save file. So as we go through this particular dialog file that I've gone through, there is a point where we enter the name. Now let's go ahead and make a way where we can save this into our visual novel. That way we save our player's name and maybe any other variables that we might want to save as well. We'll also include the variable store because we'll want variables that we declare inside of our dialog file. But let's start with the player name. So if I input my name, then I should be able to save that to file. And that should be recallable anytime I reload this game file. So how do we do that? So when we were working with our variable store, we were working with different types of variables that we could make. And there are internal variables that are created and they are saved in the different databases. But then we also have linked variables, which can link any sort of value and assignment to a real variable in a different place. We could assign our character name as a linked variable inside of the database. Now, the precaution that I announced there was that any sort of external variable in the database needs to have its link refreshed every time the game is loaded. Otherwise, you'll have dead links and you won't be able to assign your values. So whatever is going to assign the character name value into the database and create an external link for it, we need to make sure that that runs every time this visual novel scene starts up. One thing we have is our visual novel manager, which is always active, and it's going to basically control things at the very start. It's going to call for the first file to load up. It's going to check and see if we have a save file that's active and then resume our session from that. So the Visual Novel Manager could also handle some live links for us. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to separate that logic from the main VN Manager. So I'm going to make a new script for it. And I guess I will make this, I'll put it in the Visual Novel folder. So I'll call this something like VN database link setup. So this script is going to be what creates our links for the database. So I'm going to put that on my Visual Novel Manager and open that script up. First thing I'll do is I will go ahead and move this into the namespace for my visual novels, and I'm going to remove start and update. I am going to pin that up here, and I'm also going to look for my VN Manager and make sure that's pinned up here as well, because I want to grab this during Awake and set up the links. So let's go ahead and check. I think in Awake, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check for that script. So that is VN database link setup. So link setup equals get component VN database link setup. If it's there, then I'm going to go ahead and call a setup function on it. So I'll make public void setup external links. And in the VN manager on start, link setup dot setup external links. So this is going to grab, or this is going to set rather, the different links for our database right inside of this script, so they're there for us every time we need them. So the variable store is static. A little while back, we made a testing script called variable store testing, and that was in, of course, the variable store episode. Let's look at that real quick because we added some external links in here. So these are examples of how we could add external links to our variable store. So I'm going to go ahead and copy one of these lines, and I'm going to go to my link setup, and I'm going to paste it right in here. Now, the only thing I need to do is I need to replace these references to something else. So I'm going to make this, I'm going to take out the main database, and I'm just going to call this the main character name. Okay, so that is going to be the name of my visual novel variable. As a matter of fact, I may put it in a database called VN for visual novel. And so what I will do is I will go ahead and link this up. So if we look at our create variable function here, we can pass in a default value. So the default value for VN main character name is just going to be nothing. If it has not been assigned yet, then it's just going to be nothing. Okay, so then the next thing we have to do is define our getter and define our setter. So if we're getting the value, then we just want to grab it from whatever game file is active. So vngamesave dot active file dot player name. We're going to go ahead and grab it from that. If we're assigning the value, then we'll say vngamesave dot active file dot player name equals value. And now through our database, we can both get and set the main character name. Now we also have a tag that can be used for our main character name, so that way we can inject it in the tag manager. So in this case, we have two ways that we can call the main character name on the screen or in the dialog. We can either reference the variable name or we can reference the tag. So let's look. We've already taken care of the variable name, so let's just look at the tag manager. Go there real quick, and our tag is main character. So right now it's just returning a static value. Instead, let's go ahead and say vngamesave dot, and I'm going to need using visual novel. So vngamesave dot active file dot player name. So now the main character name will inject whatever that value is for whatever active file we are currently using. So in my complex dialog file here, what I could do if after I get this input, in order to save it into that field, I could reference the variable by having the $sign vn dot main char name equals input. And then I can just reference this variable in these other sections. So if input, or if, if input, I need to swap out the input tag. For the variable, I could very well do that. And it should work the same. So with our gamesave testing script active, since that's the one that creates the initial game file right now, let me just go ahead and go to the input. Here we are. I'm going to put in my little name. Actually, I'm going to put in something different. I'm going to put in puppy, just so we have something different. There we are. Nice to meet you, puppy. Okay, the variable is saved. So, okay, looking good. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. So we now save the file. Let me see where it is, and we should be able to see that saved to our actual game file. All right, there we are. Now we can see player name is set to puppy. So assigning it to the external variable did link it right into our visual novel save file. Now, so I can really see this work as we reload the file, I'm going to go ahead and say narrator again, you tell me your name is this. All right. So we come here and we save the dude. Accept, nice to meet you. I'm going to go ahead and save, and then I'm going to quit. And at this point, our variable has not been declared, but it should be saved in our file, so we should still be able to see it in the next lines. So there we are. Nice to meet you. So come here often. Again, you tell me your name is, yep. Okay, so we can see that it is linked up to our active game file, and that is being saved. But having to reference the variable all the time is not something we need to do. We just need to do that for the initial assignment. So I'll go ahead and change this to main character name as the tag, which is a little easier to read, or a little easier to write, rather. Actually, my tag is not main char name, it's main char. So just get your naming conventions right, and it won't throw you off. So I just need to make mine main char like that. And it works with the tag. If we wanted to give ourselves a command for that, we can come into the commands, database, extensions, and open up our general extension. And we can just define a new command here. And I can do so by making a new command called setPlayerName, which calls a action with a single string parameter called setPlayerNameVariable. This is just a private static void where I'm going to access the variable on the VNGameSave. So I'll use the visualnovel.vngamesave.activefile.playerName equals data. And actually, I would probably end up putting this in a different extension just for the visual novels, which is exactly what I've decided to do. I made a new script for the database extensions just for the visual novel commands, and I've added this command inside of there. That way, I can keep all the visual novel commands separate from the rest of the stuff. So if I ever decide to reuse the command system, I can do so without having to go through and manually remove the visual novel references. And so instead of referencing the variable name, which I very well can do, I could also do set player name as the command and just pass in input as the parameter. There we go. And so now I'll go ahead and type in Valerie. So that's my name. Not really. Except only I get it's nice to meet you input. The reason that we got input in the command is because tags have not been injected into commands. Now, we can't just go and inject tags into the lines before we parse it so that we get it for dialogue, speaker, and commands all at once. We have to do them separately because we still need the raw line with the variables for when we go to check if there's logic in there. So if we just go ahead and inject the variables beforehand, then we'll never know when we're trying to do assignments. So we just need to do it, after the fact. So we need to make sure that we also inject the tags and the variables into command parameters as well. Now I think I'll do this in the dialog parser. So the commands don't need to be, evaluated for logical lines. That's just the dialogue. But what we do want to do is we want to make sure that if we do have any commands that are being thrown in, that we go ahead and inject the tags into them. So I could make a little line here and say commands equals tag manager dot inject commands. And we go ahead and inject any variables and tags right into our commands. Again, we don't want to do it with speaker here because speaker still needs to get the character customizations based off of the main character tag. So we don't want to inject them into the speaker here either. This is just for the commands because the commands need the tags injected into them. There's no other sort of checks, there's no other sort of dependencies for them, so we can go ahead and inject tags right into the commands here. So I've gone ahead and logged a little comment there telling me why. But what this then allows us to do is to call the input and pass in the input as the parameter to this command, which then applies it to our tag and our variable for the main character, at which point we can then use the tag or the variable to look at the main character name, which is saved in our file. So I go ahead and hit Valerie, accept, and there we go. The tag goes ahead and takes it, and it has been applied from the command. If we want to save the rest of the variables in our variable store, then we need to do that inside of our game save as well. So I'm going to come to the VN system inside of the data containers and make one more data container for the variables. This will be the variable data, or this will be the VN variable data. The variable data is going to be serializable, and it's simply going to have the name of the variable and the value, which will be represented as a string. Then in the VNGameSave script, I'm going to make two new functions just like we did for our conversation data because we're going to get it in much the same way. So I will make a new private string array for all these items. And you know what? No, actually, I'm going to make, I'll make it a string array. So I'm going to do get variable data and then private void set variable data to reapply it to the screen. When we save, I'm going to go ahead and store all of this. So I'll have a public string array variables, and I'll say that variables equals get variable data. And when we reapply it, I'm going to go ahead and say we'll set the variable data. So set variable data. And I'll do that before set conversation data, just in case there are variables that need to be called for the conversations. Our databases are private, but I'm going to need access to them now. And even if I make a function to get them for me, I'm still going to have access to the databases themselves to make changes, so I can just go ahead and make this public anyway. So this will now be public for us, and we can access this through our game save. So for each database in variable store.databases, we can go through each one of these and grab all of the variables and save their values. So for each, we'll go var variable in database dot. Okay, so the database is actually, yeah, that's a dictionary. So we need to get each database in the database values, and then we can now access database dot variables. So we get all the variables from all the databases, and we can go ahead and create a new variable entry here. So vn variable data equals new vn variable data. So then variable data dot name is going to equal the database followed by the variable name. So we need to do it in this format, because once we reapply it, we need to reapply it in the way that the variable store is going to be able to interpret what it belongs to. So we'll have the database followed by the dot followed by the variable name. So the database, which is going to be we need the name of the database, and then the variable dot value dot, what is this? Oh no, we don't want the value. The value is actually the data for the variable. We want the key, which is the variable name. So that's going to be the name. And then the variable data dot value is going to equal the variable dot value and dot to string. So whatever it is, we're going to convert it into a string, and that's going to be the value. So we need a list. We need a list of our variable, or our vn variable data for the return data equal a new list. And so for each one we create, we'll go ahead and say return data dot add variable data, and at the very end return ret data dot to array. Okay, and I actually don't need to make this a string, because we know exactly what type it's going to be. It's going to be the vn variable data. Our conversations need to be different because we didn't know what type it was going to be, which is why we saved it in JSON format, but we know what our variable is going to be. So we can just save it in that serialized array there. So we go ahead and save that. Let's just make sure that it works real quick. So here we go. I'm going to go ahead and go to testing and enable my variable store testing script. That way it generates some variables for me. And I'm going to go ahead and save. So I'll save now, and let's look at the file. So I can see that it did save all the variables, but it also saved just the type of the value, the variable store variable, not the value itself. So we need to change that slightly. So instead, we need to do .get. So that way we get the value, and we're able to convert that to a string. But just in case our value is null, let's go ahead and just make a temporary string called value, and then set that equal to whatever the value may be in here. That way we don't get any kind of null reference error in case one creeps up. So this will be variable.value.get right inside of a string, so it'll convert it automatically for us, and it won't throw us any null references. So there we go. So if we try this again, I've enabled my variable store so I get all those variables, and now I'm going to save. And now looking back in my file, I can see I get the variables, their database, and the variable name, followed by the value that is supposed to be in there. So that handles it for everything that I'm working with. So that's how we get all the variables. So we can grab them and save them to our file, and now once we load, it's time to set the variable data and reapply everything to the way it's supposed to be. So let's go ahead and go through every variable inside of our list here. So for each var variable in variables, let's go ahead and make sure that these things get applied to our store. So we need to figure out what kind of variable it is that we saved by trying to parse it. So the very first thing is let's go ahead and grab our value so that way it's easy for us to try to parse. So I'll get string val as variable dot value. And then let's check if it's a Boolean first. If we can parse it as a Boolean, then let's go ahead and set the value of the variable to the Boolean value. Otherwise, if it's an integer, then let's set the value as an integer. Thirdly, if it's a float, then let's assign the variable as a float value. And if all else fails, assume it is a string and assign it to the variable as a string value. So I'm going to go in this value and I'm going to change up a couple of these variables. It's important that, well, for the last demonstrations, I've been separating everything into individual lines. But if we're going to be using this value and we're going to be reading it back, then we don't want to move things into different lines. We want to work on them in the space that they're in, so that way it can, as it deserializes this back into the original class using the JSON utility, it doesn't have any issues. So let's just edit some values in place here. So I'm going to change hello to goodbye, and I'm going to change the main character name to myself, and I'll change the world to everyone, and then just change a couple values. So 56 for the integer, and then the float is going to be 96.5. My Boolean is going to be true. The dblink string is going to be a random string. Number, I'll make 10. Number 5 is going to be 500. Then float 1 is going to be 755. Light is on is going to be false. So I'm basically changing all of these values, and we should be able to see those inside of the database. So with that file now modified, we should be able to see it load all these values back into the variable store. Again, this is just for testing purposes, just to make sure that everything's reading right. So I'm going to enable the variable store, and we can see all of our default values are cached here. So I've got hello world, main character name is empty, and then these numbers are 00 false, empty string, and all these things are just at their defaults right now. So I'm going to disable variable store because I don't know if I have anything tied to the L key, and I'm going to hit the L key now to load with game save testing, and enable variable store testing again, and press the Q key to reload the database and print out the changes. Again, we can see the default database has hello world, main character name is empty, and all these values, we got a bunch of zeros there. So now let's hit Q, and we got the new database. So default now says goodbye everyone, just like what I set in the file. Main character is Avira, which actually got applied to the save file, and our integers are no longer 0, we don't have a blank string, and our Boolean, well, those numbers are changed too, and our Boolean is changed to false, where it was true a moment ago. So, yep, our variable store is being saved and reloaded from the save file, which means anything that we create and use for conditions inside of our dialog files will be saved and maintained through the sessions. Now, if you really want to make this secure and prevent any issues with casting, such as if you have maybe a whole number applied to a float that is actually supposed to be a float, it could be identified as an integer instead of a float, then you might have problems. So if you want to make sure that you're getting exactly the same type, then you need to also save within the variable data container the type of variable that's being saved. And it's just one extra field, but it will help us ensure that we don't have invalid casts. So for our VM variable data, under value, let's also make a public string for type. And then when we go to add this thing in, let's go ahead and say variable data dot type equals our, let's go ahead and get the variable dot value. And then when we're getting these values, let's go ahead and assign the type. So we have to be careful about this, because if the string is empty, then the value could return null, and then we'll get null reference exceptions. So let's just make sure that our value is not empty if it's not a string empty. So that's only going to be true if we have an empty string. It's not going to be true if we have an integer or a float or a boolean or anything like that. It's only for strings. So we know if we have an empty value, then it's got to be a string. So let's just check that. Let's go ahead and say that variable data dot type is going to be equal to something. Let's see if val equals string dot empty. If it does, then the type that we're looking at is system.string. And if it's not, then we're going to grab the type based off of the value that was returned. So variable dot value dot get type dot to string. And we'll go ahead and save the type of the variable along with this variable entry. And so when we set the variable data, instead of trying to parse it, let's go ahead and switch based off of the type. So we'll go with our variable, we'll go with the variable dot type. So the different types that we can have. Let's go ahead and save a file and take a look at the types that are saved. So these are all the types that we've incorporated into our variable store right now. We have a string, which is a system.string, and we have a integer, that was a little test there. We have an integer, which is int32, and a float is represented as system.single. So let's just start with a boolean. Let's go ahead and copy, or just type in system.boolean, and let's switch the type. So case, let's look and see if what we're looking at is a system.boolean. If it is, then we need to get the Boolean value. So let's go ahead and try to do this if we are under a system Boolean. And break. Now, if this succeeds, let's go ahead and continue to the next one. Next thing we can look for is case system.int32, which is our integers. And again, let's try to cast this as an integer. And if it's true, then we'll go ahead and apply that to our variable store and continue. Otherwise, we'll break and we'll proceed to the next case. And that next case would be system.single for the float type. So we'll grab our float and we'll paste that in here. If it works, we'll continue to the next. Otherwise, break. And the last one that we're looking for is system.string. And so what we're going to do here is simply just go ahead and apply it as a string. Now, the reason we are doing these continues is that way if we find a match, then we'll just move on to the next iteration in the loop. So if we have not found a match after any of these things, then we'll go ahead and debug and log a message. Debug.log error could not interpret variable type. And I'm going to pass in the variable dot name equals the variable dot type. Okay, so this should go ahead and make sure that no matter what we've got, even if we've got zeros and they might be identified as floats, they will be stored with the type of the system single for their floats or their integer, whatever they may be. And best way that we can look at this is by looking at these two variables here. We have an integer and a float, both of which are equal to 0. If we weren't including this type alongside of the variables, then there'd be no way of differentiating this as an integer from a float. But if we're including the type, then we know that it belongs to an integer, and we know it belongs to a float, so we can reapply it to the variable store in the correct format. And actually, I just need to change break to continue. Otherwise, we'll encounter that message even if we apply a string. So String just needs to continue no matter what. Okay, so let's roll through this. Let's go ahead and our variable script, our variable store testing script is open, and we've got all our variables there. So I'm going to go ahead and set my name, accept, and move on to the third conversation, which would be this second choice. Sure did. There we go. All right, and now I'm just going to set the values here to some random number that I can see when it's changed, when we reloaded. 55.75 var bool, and var string a random value. Okay, so now I'll go ahead and save, and I should be able to see our values saved here in the variable store. So I'm going to close out, and let's actually look at the file real quick. So here's our file, pretty big, just a lot of stuff in here, not actually that big, but we can see VN main character name is saved with the value of my name that I put. The type is system string, the L integer value has the value I saved, and it's the type systint32. Then the float has my value, system.single. And yep, so it looks like everything has been saved well. So let's go ahead and now reload all this. So we're in a new file, all this is empty, and I'm gonna hit the L key now. There we go. So we've gone back to where we left off at when I saved, and I can continue, and we're going through the conversations where we left off, right to the very end. We can see the variables that I defined have been saved and reloaded to the variable store. And if I go ahead and print the variable store, we can see that, yep, my character name is saved and all those values are there. So that's where we're going to end off this episode. That's basically all the information we need to save. There may be a couple more things here and there, or a couple things specific to your project, but this is basically it. Our history states cover most everything. Then we've got our conversations, the files that they were loaded from. They're all saved and working, and this variable store is up and running. We've got the standalone variables for our save files, such as the slot number and the player name. And any other variables that we might want to add, we can just throw in either the variable store or the save file itself. That's basically all that we need for our save files. So we're still going to need to do the preview screenshot. We'll actually do that in the next episode. Not this one, but the one where we start working with the main menu and configuring the menus and the config screens. But in the next part, we're going to encrypt and decrypt these files. That way, you can't just go in and modify the values like we've done here. So, hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.